International news now.
So we want to begin today with a brief review of the main components of the Iran nuclear deal that was completed in 2015 during the Obama administration. This multilateral agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, was reached between the P5+1 group of countries and Iran. It effectively traded a relaxation of significant economic sanctions on the sale of Iranian oil for significant limitations on the capacity of Iran to enrich sufficient quantities of uranium so that Iran could then build a nuclear weapon until at least, for a decade, until at least 2025. Now, the United States leveraged the economic costs on Iran of an extensive international sanctions regime that dramatically curtailed Iran's oil sales in global markets and limited Iran's access to financial reserves held in international financial centers to pressure Iran to the negotiating table. So let's go ahead to that slide, right? So the basic outline, and here are some of the main participants and groups and states that are interested and shaped by this deal, and this is taken from your textbook, right? But so the idea is economic pain to bring Iran to the negotiating table to get them to agree to long-term limitations on their uranium enriching capacity so they couldn't build a nuclear bomb. Now, the Obama administration views this diplomatic agreement as the best vehicle to halt the Iran nuclear program without waging a war against Iran. So the Obama administration views this as a peace settlement. Now, Israel instead had pressed the United States for preventive military attacks against Iran. When we go ahead and go to the next slide, right? And specifically what Israel has long sought to do is target enrichment facilities or supportive facilities such as those at Natanz that were key to the Iranian nuclear program. Now, Presidents Bush and Obama had repeatedly resisted such calls for the use of military force to halt the Iranian nuclear program. So consequently, we should think about this agreement as a peace treaty. It was designed to prevent war by limiting Iran's capability to build a nuclear weapon. Accordingly, it hypothetically alleviated, or should have alleviated, Israel's concerns that Iran might use its nuclear weapons in the future to attack Israel, or potentially create a situation in which Iran could use its nuclear weapons to extract political concessions from Israel by threatening to use nuclear weapons. But this deal, reached in 2015, is also subject to what we now know and what we've talked about repeatedly in this class is the commitment problem. All sides worried about each other's willingness to uphold the deal indefinitely into the future. Israel worried that Iran would cheat. And cheating here would mean continuing to develop enrichment capacity in secret. So there were important verification mechanisms embedded within this deal that were supposed to be managed by the International Atomic Energy Association. But Israel worried that Iran would cheat, that these deals, that these components, these implementation, these monitoring attributes of the deal wouldn't be effective. So Israel worries about Iran's commitment, long-term commitment to peaceful uranium enrichment and Iran's unwillingness to impose restrictions on that. Right. Israel also worried, and we can turn the slide off for now, and Israel also worried that the terms of the agreement would actually make it easy, or relatively easy, for Iran to restart its nuclear weapons program in 10 years after the deal expired. In part because the deal would grant Iran access to economic resources that could potentially in the future be diverted to the nuclear program. So Iran's worried about how either the present or future possession of nuclear weapons by Iran is going to alter the balance of power in the regional political order. So Israel is saying Iran won't abide by the deal. The United States is saying we've built mechanisms within the JCPOA, monitoring restrictions through the IAEA that should alleviate some of these concerns and help us pressure Iran to commit to upholding the deal over the long run. Well, we got a shift in American national interest, though, with the inauguration of President Trump. And this activates another commitment problem that was associated with the inability of President Obama to get widespread congressional support for the agreement in 2015. President Trump had campaigned as a candidate in opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. He said it was not in the U.S. interest. He repeatedly said it was a bad deal. He viewed the Iran nuclear accord as more threatening to Israel, in part because the United States gave away too much economically. Iran could use these economic resources to rebuild its nuclear program and support militia groups that were targeting Israel. In other words, the deal itself was a threat to Israel and to U.S. interests. So President Trump and the United States destroyed the deal by withdrawing from it in 2018. But again, this activates another commitment problem. And here the problem is not Iran living up to the terms of the agreement, but it's the United States not living up to the terms of the agreement because of very different interests, because of U.S. elections, and because the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, held very different interests and beliefs about the effectiveness of this agreement. And so if you recall from our discussion, one of the very first modules of the course, we cast this agreement as a prisoner's dilemma agreement. And effectively what happens is the United States plays defect here. And then Iran moves to play defect as well in 2019 when they resume uranium enrichment. And so this is the situation we face today. Iran, up until a few weeks ago, was getting closer to getting a nuclear bomb. And the Biden administration was trying to coax Iran into rejoining the deal. It appeared that these efforts would be successful as Iran had agreed to the resumption of informal talks in Europe. They'd even created two working groups, one which was tasked to thinking about how do we bring Iran into compliance, what steps have to be taken, what monitoring measures have to get put in place. And then there's a second working group created in Vienna designed to, all right, the Trump administration imposed 1,600 new sets of sanctions on Iran. What's going to be the procedure by which each of these sets of sanctions are relaxed? So there are working groups in place. It looks like they're making progress. And then on April 11th, Israel launches an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz, potentially threatening all of the diplomatic efforts by both the United States and Israel into resuming some form of this agreement. And that leaves us to where we are now. And so we want to move to talk more about these military attacks, and we're going to do that by examining a series of clips from a recent episode of the Daily podcast from the New York Times. So let's go ahead and run that first clip.
Of the U.S., Iran, and Israel. It's Monday, April 19th. David, describe what happened in Iran last Sunday.
Well, Michael, it's still a little bit mysterious to us, but here's what we do know. There's a giant nuclear fuel enrichment site called Natanz in Iran, and that plant is basically like a military base. It's surrounded by barbed wire. There's anti-aircraft all over the place, right? There's a number of different buildings, but the central one looks almost like a warehouse. And deep underground, 25 feet underground, is something called the centrifuge hall. This is where these giant silvery machines stand in neat rows, spinning away at supersonic speeds, turning uranium gas into an enriched product. And if you enrich it to just like 3% enrichment, you can use it for producing nuclear power. But if you keep going, you can use it to build a nuclear bomb. And that's why this has always been a place that the U.S., Israel, the Europeans, everyone is focused on. There are probably more satellites looking at this building at any given time than any other spot on Earth. And a week ago Sunday, in the early morning hours, when there was no one around,
an explosion at the Natanz nuclear facility destroyed an internal power system. It could take up to 9 months.
Some kind of giant explosion ripped through the system and appeared to take out the power grid that keeps massive amounts of electricity flowing to these machines.
It happened just hours after Iran launched a new set of brand new advanced centrifuges for faster uranium enrichment.
We don't know if that explosion was caused by someone placing explosives down there. That's the most likely theory. The second theory is that there was some kind of a cyber attack that might have actually gotten to this power supply. In any case, the explosion was huge, and it did take out the power supply. And when the power supply stops at a centrifuge facility, these spinning rotors inside these centrifuges come to a crashing halt, taking out the centrifuges themselves.
Now, one of the lawmakers has said that several thousand centrifuges have been destroyed. Now, Iran is saying...
And by the Iranian account, 60 or 70% of the centrifuges down there were destroyed in seconds.
So whatever happened in this closely watched, very important hall of centrifuges, it inflicted a tremendous amount of damage to this facility.
That's right. And the Iranians came out and announced it right away. And they had two things. They said,
what
happened in Natanz?
This was no accident.
And what we are hearing from different sources, it confirms that Israel was behind this incident.
And this was the Israelis. The Israeli press is full of reports describing Israeli responsibility for it. So I don't think there's any doubt that it was the Israelis. But the fascinating part of this, Michael, is that the Israelis decided to do this alone and just give sort of cursory warning to the Biden administration. They called basically moments before this was going to happen to say something big was going to happen to the Iranian program, but they didn't give Biden enough time to get in the way of it.
Well, tell us the story of how Israel gets to that point where coordination is no longer possible, it no longer happens, and the U.S. and Israel are no longer on the same page when it comes to Iran.
Well, Michael, with President Obama, a huge philosophical gulf opened up between the Israelis and the Americans.
Okay, so let's first review a few of the important details of this recent attack on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz. The first thing to note is that this attack was successful. It destroyed 60 to 70% of centrifuges at the military installation, and this damage will dramatically slow Iran's ability to enrich uranium and increase the time it will take for Iran to build a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran has promised to rebuild those capacities, but that will take time because these are sophisticated instruments and they're under extreme economic sanctions. Second,
hey, Ryan, Sorry, can I interrupt? Sure. Briefly, let's talk. Can we put that slide up? And one thing, I just want to mention something about breakout capacity here before we come to the Israeli government. And breakout capacity is important. And this was carefully negotiated in the initial deal. And breakout capacity is, so what happens if the deal falls apart, Iran withdraws from the deal? How long will it take before they have sufficient uranium to produce a nuclear weapon? The deal was designed to keep that breakout time at least a year. So imagine the deal is signed in 2015, Iran withdraws in 2022, they couldn't have a nuclear bomb until 2023. Well, when Trump pulls the US out of the nuclear accord in 2018, Iran begins enriching uranium again at much higher levels in 2019. American intelligence officials believe that their breakout time right now is 2 to 3 months rather than a year, that they've reduced that breakout time. That's why this military attack is so significant, because it likely pushed that breakout time back much further. And this also tells us something about why Israel probably went ahead and launched this attack now. It was to lengthen that breakout time again.
Right. And one of the things that spurred this negotiation in the first place was that increasingly shrinking breakout time that Iran was getting prior to the 2015 deal in the first place. They were getting closer and closer and getting to a year or less for breakout time. And so they struck a deal to sort of maintain that breakout time for at least a year. Now, why is a year so significant? Well, a year provides those who feel threatened by Iranian nuclear weapons program some time to respond and perhaps even preemptively use military force to set that program back. But if the breakout time is 2 to 3 months, Iran could produce nuclear weapons in a short amount of time that would then allow it to have a nuclear deterrent and a nuclear response to any of sort of those attacks. So breakout time is essential here and helps to explain these military actions. So Iran launches this attack and successfully destroys a large proportion of those centrifuges that are enriching uranium at a higher level, elongating or expanding the breakout time back to something closer to a year or more, right? Second, it's pretty clear that the Israeli government was responsible for these attacks because these details were leaked through the Israeli press. This suggests that the Israeli government wanted everyone to know that they did this. Now, why would that be the case? The third big point here then is that Israel is sending a signal here. It wants the Iranians to know that they have the capability, the capacity to launch attacks like this on Iranian territory. This means that they have intelligence services and assets within Iran capable of launching military actions that can take out and threaten Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, this signal is not only something that was directed, and this action as a signal is not only something directed toward Iran, it was also a signal to the Biden administration. Israel, by taking military action, especially at this time, during these negotiations for a new peace settlement that would exchange economic sanctions or relief from economic sanctions for a halt in the nuclear program in Iran, Israel doesn't like that deal. And we'll talk more about that in the next section. And it was sending a signal to the Biden administration saying they were willing to experience a larger break in the alliance between the United States and Israel, which is a huge deal, right? This is a long-standing alliance, and go it alone in limiting Iranian nuclear capacity and using military force to do that. So let's run the next clip from the Daily Cut podcast. And in this segment, we'll focus on disagreements between Israel and Iran over how best to curtail Iran's nuclear program. And this disagreement is what is provoking the significant conflict between the United States and Israel. So let's run that clip now.
Over how to best achieve their long-term goal, their shared goal of keeping the Iranians from ever being able to have the capability to build a nuclear weapon. Obama's view was the only lasting way to go do this is to strike a diplomatic agreement, one in which Iran was lured back into the West, knew it could sell its oil, had economic prosperity going, and that there was a future. And his bet was that over time, the Iranian leadership would pass away, and there was a shot at getting a new, more liberal regime.
Mm-hmm.
The Israeli view was the complete opposite, that you could never trust any kind of diplomatic agreement that you reached with the Iranians, and that the only way to solve a problem like this is to periodically go back and do what the Israelis call mow the lawn.
Which is what?
It means you go in and you bomb or destroy a set of nuclear facilities, and when they grow back up, you pull out your lawnmower and you go bomb it again.
Wow.
You keep doing this until they get the idea that whatever they build, you will destroy.
That's a major philosophical difference. So how does that start to play out?
The White House released this photo tonight showing President Obama on the phone with Iranian President Rouhani. It's the first time leaders of the two nations have had direct contact since the Carter administration.
So Obama uses continued harmful sanctions on Iran to get the Iranians to sit down and negotiate a new nuclear deal.
The key players are now in Geneva talking over Iran's nuclear program.
Obama sends a team out to negotiate with the Iranians. They meet in Vienna, they meet in Geneva, they meet all over Europe. And by early 2015,
the Iranian foreign minister claimed the Iranians are close to reaching a nuclear deal with the United States.
It's becoming pretty clear they're getting near a deal.
We are very close, very close.
Netanyahu is again speaking out against any potential nuclear deal between.
And the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is beside himself.
Netanyahu says Rouhani is, quote, a wolf in sheep's clothing.
And decides that the only way that he can assure Israel's own security is to stop this deal from happening. So he was furiously lobbying behind the scenes, enraging Obama. And then he actually came to Washington.
Thank you, America. Thank you for everything you've done for Israel.
And at the invitation of the Republican leadership, addressed a joint session of Congress.
The deal now being negotiated, that deal will not prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It would all but guarantee that Iran gets those weapons, lots of them.
To denounce the President of the United States' leading piece of diplomacy around the world.
Let me explain why.
Netanyahu had a few arguments. The first was,
Iran has proven time and again that it cannot be trusted.
You're being deeply naive.
Iran was also caught twice, not once, twice, operating secret nuclear facilities in Natanz and Qom, facilities that inspectors didn't even know existed. Right now, Iran could be hiding nuclear facilities that we don't know about.
That the Iranians hid a bomb project in the early 2000s that the United States and others uncovered, and that project has never really gone away. Secondly, he was saying,
Iran's goons in Gaza, its lackeys in Lebanon, its revolutionary guards on the Golan Heights are clutching Israel with three tentacles of terror.
You don't live in the neighborhood. We do. Iran doesn't have missiles that can reach New York and Chicago, but they sure have missiles that can reach Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And his third argument was,
virtually all the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program will automatically expire in about a decade.
At the end of the day, you'll never know if your agreement will be too short-lived to give you a permanent guarantee that the Iranians could not build a weapon.
Iran would then be free to build a huge nuclear capacity that could produce many, many nuclear bombs.
And, you know, he had a point here because the main parts of the agreement as they were emerging in this negotiations allowed the Iranians to do more and more work by 2025. And by 2030, there would be no limits at all on the amount of nuclear fuel that Iran could produce.
This is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal. We're better off without it.
It was completely strange to have a foreign leader come and basically denounce a U.S. diplomatic effort in front of the Congress with applauding Republicans and some applauding Democrats, and one man missing. Vice President Joe Biden did not show up in Congress that day because he would not be seen sitting behind the Prime Minister of Israel, politely clapping as the Israeli Prime Minister tried to dismantle the administration's main diplomatic achievement. But, of course, the deal did ultimately get agreed to.
Right.
And for the last year of Obama's presidency, it was going into effect with constant criticism from the Israelis. But then Donald Trump gets elected, and suddenly things look very different.
Right, because, of course, he rescinds the nuclear deal, which I'm sure makes Israel quite happy.
Yes, by the spring of 2018, he pulls out of the deal, he reimposes sanctions. The Iranians start producing nuclear material again a year later because they're going to put pressure on Trump just as he's putting pressure on them. And then, of course, Trump loses. And suddenly back in office is a man who had supported the deal, Joe Biden.
So let's talk about some of the things from this clip. First, note that the United States and Israel share the same policy goal with respect to Iran's nuclear program. They agree. They both want to deny Iran the ability to acquire nuclear weapons. They fundamentally disagree, though, over the best policy means or the best strategy to achieve that goal. The Obama and Biden administrations want to use diplomacy. They think a mix of carrots and sticks are the best vehicle to get an enduring agreement. Netanyahu and the Israeli government disagree. They think that diplomacy, relaxing the sanctions, is too risky, and they will use military force to mow the lawn or launch periodic military attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities, or, they've done this as well, assassinate key personnel in the Iranian nuclear program to slow or impair Iran's technical capacity to build a nuclear weapon. Right, so this disagreement is fundamental. Diplomacy versus force, right? A military strategy that entails a much higher risk of war. Second, we can trace this disagreement between the United States and Israel over what to do about Iran to something that we've talked about repeatedly in here, the long-term commitment problem. Right. What is Netanyahu saying in that speech to Congress? He's arguing that Iran will not, in the long term, abide by any commitment or pledge within the JCPOA to forego the development of its nuclear weapons program. You can't trust Iran. It has had secret facilities in the past and might have secret facilities now. And he argues that the temporary nature of the deal is dangerous in and of itself. Iran, given its past tendencies, given that we can't trust it, is likely just to restart its program after 2025 and be in a better position because it's gotten financial relief by then. So it should have acquired more resources to accelerate its program. As a consequence, right, the Israeli strategy, as it was demonstrated a couple of weeks ago, is given this long-term commitment problem, it's better to fight now, to launch these targeted military strikes that mow the lawn, that deny Iran capacity to develop nuclear weapons before Iran gets more powerful. The third thing we want to point out here is this is really an amazing story of domestic political interference by a U.S. ally. Think about this Netanyahu speech before Congress in 2015, the picture here on your slides we're showing you. What is Netanyahu trying to do with this speech? He's actively trying to undermine domestic support for a sitting president of the United States, publicly challenging the wisdom of a signature foreign policy initiative of the Obama administration, right? Which was going to be the resumption of a diplomatic relationship between the United States and Iran to create a long-term peace agreement between the United States and Iran. So what does this tell us about foreign policy making in a democracy? I think to answer that question, let's think about a different hypothetical. In an authoritarian regime, say in which opposition groups in China invite a sitting president of the United States to give a speech at a national congress of the Communist Party, and in that speech, President Biden criticizes the policies of the sitting president of China, Xi Jinping, relative to, say, India or Taiwan. Is that going to happen? No. Yes. Right? That would never happen.
In Russia either.
Rob just said not in Russia either. That's never going to happen in an authoritarian regime. Instead, in a democracy like the United States, opposition politicians, in this case, Republican leadership in Congress, can effectively build a political coalition with foreign actors. Israel, in this case, inviting them to participate in U.S. domestic politics. And Republicans here are leveraging Netanyahu for domestic political gain to challenge the foreign policy initiatives of a sitting president. Moreover, what's Netanyahu doing? He's directly appealing to the American public in this speech to try and build public opposition to Obama's Iran policies. So we can see how rules protecting open political competition in a democracy simultaneously create significant opportunities for foreign actors to be major players in domestic politics.
Can I jump in here, Pat, for a second? Yeah, so one of the things that wasn't emphasized as much in the clip is the role of the Republican Party in the United States on this. It was very significant that the Republican Party controlled the House of Representatives at this time, because they then invited Netanyahu to give a speech to the joint sessions of Congress. Divided government plays a role here as well. The Republican Party and Donald Trump in 2016 as the nominee for president agreed with Netanyahu about this, in this gulf between the United States and the Obama administration and Netanyahu. They didn't think that Iran could be trusted. They didn't like the Iran deal because it ended after 10 years, and they agreed that that was really dangerous because Iran could just resume a nuclear program after the deal expired. And so that coalition, as Pat just pointed out, was crucial. If the Republican Party didn't have that foothold and that majority control in Congress, then this speech wouldn't have happened.
So let's move on to the third clip now. And this is going to integrate domestic politics in Iran into the story, and how Israeli actions are complicating the efforts of the Biden administration to get some form of the JCPOA back in place. One thing to keep in mind as you're listening to the clip, remember our conversation about two-level bargaining games to help us understand the domestic politics of international relations and foreign policy. We can see that two-level game going on in this next clip. So let's go ahead and roll it.
Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the core of the military, because they were afraid that the agreement put too many constraints on their nuclear program and that Iran, like any other country, should have the right to enrich uranium.
Mm-hmm.
So to the hardliners in Iran, this was just another humiliation. Remember, they're not looking at this explosion in isolation. They're remembering that in January of 2020, Donald Trump killed their most revered leader, General Soleimani, in a drone strike.
Right.
And then there's a faction in Iran that basically wants to say, hey, we reached an agreement with the United States in 2015, and then you elected Donald Trump and he blew it up. And now we're going to reach another agreement with Joe Biden. And anybody want to tell me what happens in 4 years, especially if a Trump-like figure emerges as the next president and they dismantle the whole thing again? The Americans are unreliable negotiating partners because they can't guarantee that any agreement that they reach with one American president will carry through 4 years later to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one side in Iran. The other side is the group of people around President Rouhani the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who negotiated the original 2015 deal, who believed that unless you get the deal back in place, you're never going to get the American-led sanctions lifted, and thus never get oil revenue flowing and never get prosperity back to the Iranian people, or at least the Iranian elites.
So just to summarize, David, Iran, in the aftermath of this latest attack from Israel, sees the world in the following way. It has a potentially not very reliable partner in these negotiations in the United States, because we pick new presidents every 4 years who may or may not like this deal. Iran has its own domestic political and economic divide about whether or not it's a good idea to participate in these talks. And looming over all of this is the fact that Israel is just going to keep finding ways to attack Iran and its nuclear program, regardless of what's going on with the U.S.
That's exactly right.
So, David, what does Iran ultimately decide to do?
U.S. officials tell the New York Times they don't know if Iran will show up tomorrow in Vienna.
So talks were supposed to begin last week in Vienna.
The big question tonight is, will Iran make a distinction between the United States and Israel?
And the Americans flew out and the Europeans all appeared. And, in fact, so did the Iranians.
Today, Iran and the United States resume indirect talks in Vienna to revive that agreement days after.
It wasn't like they ignored what happened on Sunday.
I assure you that Natanz will definitely, in the near future, progress with more advanced centrifuges. And if
they're making brave statements that when they go build back, they will build back better with new, improved centrifuges that run much more efficiently.
Iran warned it will begin enriching uranium to 60% purity, the highest level yet, but still short of weapons grade.
They announced that they were going to begin to purify uranium at a much higher level, 60% of enrichment, which essentially means one step short of what you need for a bomb. So they're trying to create their own form of pressure on the United States, but they just moved forward.
All eyes are on Vienna, with many sides hoping that despite the incident at Natanz, there can still be a breakthrough.
So if these talks between the U.S. and Iran continue, as it looks like they probably will, did Israel accomplish what it set out to do here?
So, Michael, I think that the Israelis would regard this as a partial success. They don't seem to have managed to have derailed the talks. But they prove that they can get inside Iran's most secret nuclear facilities and do great damage. If the Israelis think that they can conduct these bold operations deep inside Iranian territory, that may be all they want.
But it feels like this partial success comes with a pretty significant cost. And the cost is real damage to the relationship between Israel and the United States. And that's a pretty sacred relationship to both countries.
It is. And what they're counting on, what the Israelis are counting on, is that the relationship is so deep, that the ties between the U.S. and Israel are so strong that it can tolerate some independent action here. That the Israelis can simply say, including to their constituency in the United States, we're here to defend our interests. That's the essence of what the Israeli state is all about. It's about creating a Jewish state in the Middle East that will survive. And that at the end of the day, the United States will forgive any action that Israel regards as fundamental to its survival.
Well, that's interesting, David, but that's a pretty significant wager on the part of Israel. And I have to imagine that this could get complicated quickly, because at the end of the day, how sustainable is it for the United States and Israel to be seeking the same goal, which is to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, but doing it in ways that directly undermine the other? How long can that possibly last?
It's a fascinating question, Michael.
Okay, so as the clip points out, we've got a sort of interesting triangular dynamic between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And that dynamic hasn't derailed the talks completely. The Israeli attack on Iran didn't end up keeping Iran from showing up at the talks in Vienna with the United States. There's still a chance that they will continue to negotiate and come up with a breakthrough, but it does present this tension because the United States and Israel agree on the goal, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but disagree vehemently on how to do that. And so what we want to do in this section is to briefly review the role of the United States historically since 2015 in undermining the deal between the United States and Iran that was struck in this Iran nuclear accord. And so it all starts in 2016 with Donald Trump getting elected as president. Donald Trump always opposed the Iran nuclear deal. He campaigned for president with a promise to end that deal, to withdraw the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. And so accordingly, U.S. foreign policy interests changed with the election in 2016 and the inauguration of Donald Trump as president. And he withdrew the United States. And so let's show this slide of the prisoner's dilemma. So he moved the United States from cooperating within the deal, that cooperate box of three with a payout of 3-3 in 2015. He moved the United States out of that by, and so in that situation, the United States was cooperating within the deal under the Obama administration. It was relaxing economic sanctions to Iran. Iran was ending its nuclear or suspending its nuclear program. And President Trump moved the United States to defecting from the deal by reimposing those sanctions in 2018. Unsurprisingly, Iran also took action that effectively withdrew Iran from the deal as well by restarting higher levels of uranium enrichment than is allowed under the JSPOA. And so the Iranians did this and continue to do so, continue to enrich uranium at higher levels to put pressure on the United States and its allies to get into a better bargaining position by potentially acquiring nuclear weapons and shortening that breakout period that we talked about down to a matter of a couple months to force the United States to make concessions to Iran in the next round of talks. And so what we had from 2015 to 2018 is this shift from mutual cooperation within the agreement to a defection, first by the United States and then by Iran, that both sides were defecting from the agreement. And so this is the situation that President Biden faced when he became president. He wants to salvage some form of the Iran nuclear deal. And he signaled that intention and a willingness to relax sanctions again on Iran if Iran agreed to stop enrichment. And so the primary way of doing this, most importantly, was the initiation of these diplomatic talks in Vienna that resumed. And so the question then became, would Israeli military actions to destroy centrifuges at Natanz undermine this tentative diplomatic progress? That's the tension. So far, not so much, but that remains to be seen. Second, let's talk a little bit about changes in U.S. domestic politics and what that means to Iran and the possibility of this deal. In a sense, the United States here is an unreliable negotiating partner. Why? Because it can't promise to sustain a deal. This is just another form of the commitment problem, except it's not a problem on the Iranian side of cheating on the deal, as Israel was arguing, but rather it's the United States that's the source of the problem here because of sharp domestic disagreement, partisan disagreement over how to stop Iran's nuclear program. This undermines the long-term pledge that the United States would have to make to a deal that would exchange a relief on economic sanctions for a suspension of Iran's nuclear deal. Because we elect a president every 4 years. The Obama administration struck a deal with Iran and provided some sanctions relief in exchange for suspension of the nuclear program. And then when the United States held an election, Donald Trump was elected, felt very differently, and just withdrew the United States out of that deal and thus changed the terms, right? And so this domestic political problem in the United States is a primary part of the context in which the United States and Iran are now negotiating. Iran suspects that, well, how can the United States really credibly promise to sustain this deal past the next election, right? Now, this domestic problem in the United States interacts with domestic politics in Iran. Now, how does that work? Well, lots of hardliners in Iran do not want any type of deal between the United States and Iran to limit the production of nuclear weapons in Iran. And so this negotiation itself exposes certain political groups within Iran to pressure. Like, for example, those groups around President Rouhani in Iran that want some form of a deal with the United States for economic reasons. It makes them vulnerable when they make concessions to the United States, such as suspending Iran's nuclear program, in exchange for relief from economic sanctions, only to have the United States exploit those concessions and make Iran look weak by withdrawing from the agreement. And so this vacillation on the deal is complicating domestic politics in Iran. And related to all this, the podcast from The Daily does a good job noting significant domestic disagreement in Iran over the wisdom of this diplomacy here. So what do the hardliners argue? Some hardliners want to race to get a nuclear weapon, as fast as possible, because they believe that this is the only way they can gain leverage in this relationship between the United States and Iran. Now, why? Because they argue Iran is the one who can't trust the United States to sustain its obligation. And they can't trust Israel, which in Iran's eyes is a very close ally to the United States, not to use military force to launch attacks inside Iran against its nuclear program. And so those Israeli attacks make Iran's security services look weak and further damage the whole process of some sort of negotiated settlement. And third, then, we need to talk about Israel's role as a spoiler in the US efforts to get a diplomatic solution to this policy change. Now, there's real uncertainty over whether Iran would have simply walked away from the diplomatic talks after that attack on Natanz. That they didn't. They showed up in Vienna, but they still might just withdraw from these negotiations. But lots of people within the administration view Israel's recent attack as directed at undermining US policy by raising the cost paid by Iran for continuing to be a negotiating partner with the United States. So this is a significant challenge to the Biden administration. Remember, the Biden administration is still new. It just took office in January. Biden wants multilateral U.S. diplomacy to work. One of the best examples of multilateral U.S. diplomacy is this Iran nuclear deal, which not only included the United States, but a whole group of countries. It wants multilateral cooperation among democracies to confront primary threats around the world. The U.S.-Israeli partnership here is a partnership between democracies, but yet here is a democracy, a key U.S. ally, that is not cooperating with the United States on a common vision, but thwarting the U.S. approach on Iran, and perhaps telling the rest of the world that it doesn't necessarily need or want U.S. leadership. And so this could very well be an ongoing dilemma here. Is Israel risking some sort of deeper breach with its longtime ally, the United States? We don't know. They suggest that they are banking on that history between the United States and Israel and the close ties there to sort of prevent some huge rupture over this disagreement on the Iran nuclear deal.
So Rob, let me just finish up briefly here and paint an overview of some of the key challenges facing the United States, and apart from Israeli efforts to spoil the agreement, some of the key technical challenges facing the United States and Iran right now to try and get a resumption of the JCPOA. The first technical thing is, how do you synchronize the exchange of concessions between the two sides? So Iran wants the U.S. to relax sanctions first as a demonstration of U.S. willingness to participate in the deal before they halt uranium enrichment. The U.S. wants the opposite. They want Iran to halt enrichment efforts before the U.S. Pulls back on sanctions. So there's a synchronizing problem here that's designed to reassure both parties. And so that's the key kind of technical thing that the working groups in Vienna are trying to solve right now. How do we sequence this so that we reassure both sides that they aren't being taken advantage of in these negotiations? That's the first thing. The second thing that's important to realize is the Biden administration is trying to secure some modifications to the 2015 deal, in part to allay some of the Israeli concerns. There's some suggestions that Biden wants to extend the timeline of the deal, ask Iran to forego future uranium enrichment efforts for a much longer period, move it from extend out the time beyond 10 years. That's significant. The other thing is, it also looks like the Biden administration, and the Trump administration tried to do this as well, wants to get some Iranian pledges to pull back on support for militia groups in the region, such as for Hezbollah and militia groups operating in Syria that are getting closer to Israel. So the Biden administration changing the goalposts a little bit here too, and that's likely to complicate these talks as well in Vienna. So that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening. If you have questions about this new segment, obviously send us an email, post something to Piazza. Otherwise, good luck moving forward through the end of the semester. If anything comes up, as always, let us know. And we hope to see you around campus, if not towards the end of this semester, but back when we get resume full board next fall. Have a good one.
Yes. All right. Thanks.